Testing, testing, testing. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's actually turn on the microphone. Yep, got it. It's coming. So, Gold, Ghosts, and Guns Hour. My name is Tom Luongo. I hope everybody's had a great day. Let's talk about Tillerson at State. Give it a second. Yep, I know. I've turned the microphone off. I'm sorry. So, I'm still kind of working out my beginnings here, so bear with. Let's talk about Tillerson. Let's talk about State. I've got an article up on my blog right now. I just put out this morning trying to go over my initial thoughts on this. We all know that Tillerson's been on the outs with Trump for a while. Now the question is, why? It's the thing that everybody wants to know. It's the thing that everybody wants to ask about. And you know, the big question here is Trump truly going full neocon, or is this part of the greater, I guess, kind of part of a greater plan? You know how I feel about this. I've talked about this in previous live chats here on YouTube. I've talked about it on my Periscopes over at which you can find me over periscope.tv/Tom Luongo. You can find it on my blog over at goldghostsandguns.com. There are links down below, and please, if you would, give a like, share this with the people on your Twitter feed, and the whole rest of it. But let's talk about why I feel that I really fundamentally believe that Trump is putting together the hard negotiation, the hard sell on a global peace deal. And it's going to look like, and it looks like he's not. It looks like he's just clamoring for war. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case at all. And I think that most commentators have this wrong, and they misinterpret the way Trump is playing this game. So let's go over it. And I think, honestly, that him and Rex Tillerson were never a good mix. If you think about it, Trump didn't have a Secretary of State candidate that was acceptable to anybody. The neocons were trying to push Mitt Romney on him. I mean, there was all sorts of stuff going on. So back in December of 2016, it was, who's going to be a Secretary of State? It was never going to be anybody like Ron Paul or anybody, rational. It was always going to have to be somebody that would be confirmable. And Tillerson, having been CEO of ExxonMobil, made him immediately confirmable because he wasn't part of the swamp in Washington. But at the same time, this man did run ExxonMobil, so he was given the keys to the most powerful oil major in the world, arguably. Meaning that he's interfaced with presidents, he's interfaced with premiers, he's talked to everybody. He's been a diplomat for the United States for years, but in a different context. It was interesting. I was reading some stuff in order to put together my article this afternoon. I ran across an interview he did back in December with a major American publication. I can't remember who it was. It wasn't Newsweek. It was another one. And he said, it was CBS News. And he said, I was hired really to sit down and talk with and grease the skids with a relationship with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. And that, I've had a good relationship with him in the past. And, and the interviewer brought this up as some way of trying to make him look like there was some collusion between him and Trump and all of this stuff. And because that's their line of reasoning. He said, look, I walked into the first meeting with Putin and I said, same person, different job. And so he and Putin get along, and they always have gotten along, and that's great. But at the same time, Obama and Hillary made it impossible for Tillerson and Trump to do their jobs relative to Russia. It was never in the cards. They had sabotaged that from the moment Trump was elected, if not months before that, in order to try and win the election. And then they just kept carrying it forward. So Tillerson as Secretary of State was always a compromised thing because his primary mission, which was to build a relationship with the Russians, wasn't there. It wasn't going to be allowed. Now, if you look at Rex's tenure and the statements he's made as Secretary of State, he's become more and more belligerent towards Russia over time. This has become policy. This is part of the Trump full court press, I believe, and the full public full court press. And I don't believe that Rex believes 1/10 of the things that he said about Putin over the course, and the Russians over the course of the last 14 months or so. And I mean that in terms of things like the chemical weapons attack last year in Syria, and now this Sergei Skripal poisoning and all of this. And so it's very obvious that Trump is trying not to antagonize the Russians. It's very obvious that MI6, as I discussed yesterday, and the UK are trying to discredit the Russians, are trying to provoke a response. If they can't get that response from Trump on the ground militarily in Syria, then they're going to go for it in some other ways in Europe. And so it continues. So the needling of the Russians continues as we continue to do, as we continue to move forward with the negotiations with North Korea and put a full court press on with Iran. I'm not crazy about Mike Pompeo. I think he's a war hawk. I think he's not a moderating voice. But that moderating voice, as I wrote today, that non-moderating voice may be exactly what Trump wants in order to run his Crazy Ivan style foreign policy, which is the way he thinks he's going to get a deal done. And let me explain. What do I mean by that? Well, let's contrast the two men. Tillerson is a classic CEO. He's gone in and had to negotiate some of the most important energy deals in the history of the world. He ran ExxonMobil for how many years? Okay, that means in oil E&P extraction and production agreements that you cut with various governments, that's going to mean everybody's going to get a little bit of what they want. Everybody's going to walk away somewhat unhappy, but somewhat finished. But it's not going to be disagreeable, because you can't go in an adversarial mode, because as the CEO of ExxonMobil, because there's 15 other oil majors out there that want the same concessions and the same blocks. So, if ExxonMobil comes in and says, yeah, you must give this to me, and they'll say, fuck you, we'll give it to Chevron or Royal Dutch Shell or Eni or OMV or whomever, it doesn't matter, right? Or the Russians, Novatek, Rosneft. And so you have to play things differently. And I think that plays into Tillerson's role as a diplomat, and he doesn't fundamentally agree with the way Trump negotiates. And I think that it's a bad fit if Trump feels that the only way that he can affect the deals that he wants and complete the deals he wants to make, the only way for him to do that is to show strength. Okay. So that Crazy Ivan routine that he's been running on the North Koreans, putting in THAAD in South Korea, constantly threatening them with destruction and fire and brimstone and everything else, is working. One could argue that it's working. One could argue it's working really well, because now the North Koreans are willing to come to the table. There's another side to this, mind you, which is that the fire and brimstone Crazy Ivan routine with North Korea isn't real. And I've argued this as well, that it's just a bluff and posturing for his U.S. audience. And that's a potentially large, that's another potential interpretation of this, that the truth of the matter is that with Russia announcing its doomsday weapons effectively, and with the North Koreans having shown mostly credibly that they have a nuclear weapon, Trump has no option but to negotiate now, to sit down and talk with the North Koreans, and potentially negotiate finally a peace treaty and an end to the Korean War. And that would mean demilitarizing the DMZ. It would mean a pullback of American forces. It would mean a whole bunch of things. But in order to get to this situation, in order to get to this moment, as far as Trump is concerned, you have to have the strength to force the moment to its crisis. And to quote T.S. Eliot, you have to be willing to go that way. You have to be willing to put all your chips in. You have to be willing to bluff as hard as possible. You have to be willing to play that kind of game. And I said this afternoon that Tillerson, being an old East Texas Eagle Scout, to him his word is his bond, and he would make deals as long as he would sit down with foreign leaders and his counterparts and say, look, I want to know just one thing. I can tell you that my word is my bond. What about you? If I believe your word is your bond, we have a deal. If I don't, I'm walking. And that was his negotiating tactic. It was about trust. And it wasn't about bluffing and leverage. Trump is all about leverage. The art of the deal is all about maximal leverage. Okay? Tillerson doesn't work that way. And so it makes sense that at the end of the day, he's going to fundamentally disagree with how Trump is handling all this and voice that displeasure and disagreement. And yeah, call him a moron. Makes sense. It also makes sense that Trump would eventually get tired of it or realize that Rex is no longer an asset now that he's done as much as he can do to clear out Foggy Bottom from an administrator's perspective. And that what he needs now is somebody who is going to support his every action and his every move, because his next set of moves are going to be an even bigger set of bluffs on Iran. And if that's the case, then Mike Pompeo is the right guy. Why? Because Mike Pompeo is down for whatever it is that Trump is going to do. Maybe it is that because Trump made this abundantly clear in his statement this afternoon. If you watch his statement, he said, Mike Pompeo and I are like, we're in sync. We agree on everything. Well, if that's the case, think about that from a negotiating tactic point of view. Then it makes sense. And it makes sense why Tillerson is out. And it makes sense that the next stage of this is that Trump is going to use his firebrand. He's going to use Pompeo. And he's going to use Nikki Haley, continue to use Nikki Haley, to put as much pressure on as possible. It's also going to put pressure on Mattis in Syria and Afghanistan. And that to me is very scary, because that could go the wrong way. But in order to pull this off, this is effectively what he has to do. At least that's what he feels he has to do. And if you look at what Trump has been doing, and Putin right alongside him, and you could potentially put together a credible theory that Putin, Jinping, and Trump had this all mapped out. And it's just a matter of going through the motions. And that Tillerson's actually not unhappy today. He's actually the happiest guy in America today, because he no longer has to do this crappy job. He no longer has to be the focal point of frustration, of Trump's ire. He no longer has to be... He's done his job. Now he no longer has to do the job. It's very possible. And if that's the case, then the next stage of this is going to be very interesting, because now we get to see whether or not we're going to push whole hog towards a real conflict resolution. I wrote about this over the weekend, and I'm implying it in today's article, and I'm applying it in this live chat, that there's a silver lining to all this, and you have to be willing to assess the players, the people, and the motivations of everybody involved in order to figure out what it is that everybody wants and what's the most likely outcome. Because the most likely outcome is not nuclear war. Even though it's easy to see how it could spiral out of control, which is possible, not discounting it. It's a non-zero probability. But the most likely scenario is that cooler heads will prevail. This will be taken All of this will be taken right up to the moment of crisis, and then we'll declare. And then there will be a reconciliation. That's what I think is going to happen. That's why I think Rex Tillerson is gone from State Department, because he wasn't going to be that guy. No one would believe that Tillerson would go along with this plan. He's been a critic of it ever since he took the job. Right? He's not going to all of a sudden change his stripes. And at the end of the day, does anybody really believe Tillerson yelling at the Russians over the Sergei Skripal poisoning? Did anybody believe Tillerson was serious, admonishing the Russians for allowing Assad to use chemical weapons in Syria last year? Does anybody believe that? Because I don't. I never did. He's just doing what he was told to do because this was what Trump wanted, even though he disagreed with the policy. Because in his mind, this is the wrong way of going about it. At the same time, and that's the most generous take that you can have on Rex Tillerson. The non-generous take on Rex Tillerson is that he's actually just a Bushite-level neocon who is really just another globalist shill, just like Gary Cohn and the rest of them, looking out for his corporate interest, even though he's retired as CEO of ExxonMobil. That's very possible as well. And that Trump just got rid of globalist Gary, and now he's gotten rid of, Rex, and Rex was only there to try and derail the MAGA program. And he was actually a stalking horse the entire time. And that's very possible. I'm not sure I buy it, but I'm not willing to entertain it. I'm not willing to not entertain it. JB St. Louis Mo believes I just nailed it with that comment, and that Tillerson's public statements about climate change and everything else. It's very possible. I mean, he's taken ExxonMobil down the virtue signaling route on climate change, but at the same time, he's also, fundamentally fought against it in court, and so he can state whatever he needs to in order to virtue signal to the public, because he is a CEO of ExxonMobil, and he's in a very, very politically dangerous position. And at the same time, he is fighting, he's fighting for, he set in motion the lawsuits that ExxonMobil filed against the EPA and the rest of it in order to stop, in order to not pay damages. So I don't know. It's again, when you're in that position, it's a very it's a very nuanced thing. Okay, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if Rex was a stalking horse for the globalists. It wouldn't surprise me. I'd be disappointed, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I don't owe Rex Tillerson any loyalty or anything. I've never been a shareholder of ExxonMobil. So there it is. So if that's the case, then really what happened today was that in a week, we got rid of two of the biggest globalist shills in the Trump administration. And we got rid of them from two of the most important positions within Trump's cabinet: economic advisor and state. All that's next is Mnuchin to go. That'd be great. I think Mnuchin's the wrong guy for the job in the first place. But I don't know who Rand Paul would be fine, but he's not going to lead the Senate. So I want you to think about these things, and we can look at it from that perspective, and we can say, well, maybe this was a very good thing. I don't know. Okay. It's never going to be an unmitigated win. The swamp is still too strong. The deep state is still too strong. The shadow government is still too strong. Trump is still in a very, very, very vulnerable position. And he's juggling a lot of things. And I just think that at the end of the day, he might have figured out that, Rex was just a globalist. And that doesn't work for him. I mean, he's not going to have it in his department. We'll see. So that's my thoughts on Tillerson. I got about 10 minutes. I don't like to do these for about 30. So I've talked about that for 19 minutes. Now let's talk about Italy. Reports already out that Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Northern League, who trounced his coalition partner, Forza Italia, in the Italian elections last week, is already talking about Plan B, leave the euro. That he's already talking about forcing through constitutional changes to allow for a euro referendum. This is not something that will happen tomorrow, but the Plan B is already there. He's got it drawn up. He's looking at reintroducing lira. He's looking at reintroducing a going into negotiations with Brussels that will be a minimum, in the understatement of the year, tense. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be fantastic. And it's exactly what I told everybody he would do. I said this in, I think, the January issue of the Gold, Goats, and Guns and Investment Newsletter. I laid out exactly how it would play out. That with the League rising in the polls, all it had to do was beat Forza Italia and in the polls, and Salvini would be in the driver's seat to become the next prime minister. The polls were gaslighting us, saying that Forza Italia still had a bit of a lead, but I'm like, no, not the way this thing is breaking. If M5S, if Five-Star Movement breaks above 30%, then the League is going to break upwards towards 15, at least 15%, if not 17. Forza Italia's percentage will probably plateau at around 14, and boom, that's exactly what happened. And this really had to do with the dynamic between the North and the South. And once that happens, the Democrats have no power. They didn't get enough of the vote. Forza Italia doesn't have any power. You notice that Berlusconi's been nowhere to be found since March 4th. The last thing we saw of Berlusconi, he was getting flashed while he was voting. That was it. We haven't seen him since. Why? He's irrelevant now. He failed. And thankfully, unlike Hillary Clinton, when he fails, he leaves the steam. He leaves the stage. Christ, that woman's like a cockroach. Won't leave. Just go away. Die already. Please. Not on. So, Salvini saying that today, and I love the fact that he said it and it broke on a Tuesday, because normally this shit doesn't come out until Friday after the markets close. Think about that. It comes out on a Tuesday. Now the market's got 3 days to churn that one over. Italian bond yields are up a little bit today, but there's nothing really important. But keep watching the 10-year and keep watching euro-dollar markets. And now, with Tillerson out and things changing a little bit, and it's going to be interesting to see if things like the LIBOR OIS spread continue to rise, because we're looking for confirmatory data that dollar liquidity is starting to dry up and people are starting to get nervous. If people are starting to get nervous and the dollar is drying up, we could go from very placid markets to very ugly markets very quickly. I don't think it's going to happen in the next couple of days or the next couple of weeks or anything, but certainly start looking at like the May window. It just seems that it would take that amount of time, one, for coalition talks in Italy to get underway. It's very possible that the center-right coalition breaks completely, and Salvini then turns around and tries to form a coalition with Five-Star Movement. He and Di Maio then turn around and they'll have enough power within the Italian government and the Italian parliament to push through constitutional changes that will allow them to go after the euro. Interesting point. And then I saw this, and someone linked it on our private Slack channel for Gold, Goats, and Guns right before I went live. There's an article at, hold on for a second, and I will get it for you. It's an article at the Daily Express, over in England. And what's important is at the bottom of the article, the last couple of paragraphs, and I'm going to try and read them to you, are as follows. We want to negotiate with the European Union about the rights that have been denied to Europeans and citizens who, with their vote, are now claiming them back. A recent study revealed 51% of Italians would be in favor of leaving the EU. The highest percentage amongst young people, who, by the way, were the ones who voted in droves to get rid of the Democrats in Forza Italia. The established parties were destroyed in this election by the younger generation. Why? The younger generation is mired in everything bad, and the younger generation in Italy is turning right, not left, unlike what they did in Greece and in Spain. Okay, the Eurosceptic movements in Greece and Spain were both leftist, fundamentally leftist. Podemos and Syriza, fundamentally leftists. and especially in Spain, it's all just flavors of leftism. But in Italy, we're seeing a move towards a much more kind of traditional, less government, less EU, kind of nationalist argument. But from we're going to lower taxes, we're going to get out of people's way, we're going to unfuck the economy, and we're going to move forward. And that's a different vibe. That's much more like France and not like Spain and Italy and even Portugal to a lesser extent. So very interesting. So that's the highest percentage that I've seen, because previous to that, the talk was all about how the radical parties like Lega Nord and M5S were both moderating their speech on leaving the euro. And I said, well, that's just a campaign tactic. The minute they get elected, forget it. You're going to see them come right out of Salvini's going to come right out of the gate, because he's going to look at the crowds and he's going to look at the response he got when he said that the euro was a crime against humanity, and he's going to double down on it. That's exactly what he did. And that's exactly what he's doing. And that's exactly what he's going to do. It's kind of good. It's excellent. Because the euro is a crime against humanity. It's certainly a crime against Italian humanity. Being second-generation Italian, I'm all for it. Go for it, Matteo. You got my vote. Unfortunately, I'm not really part of the diaspora, so, fat lot of good it'll do you. But, moral support, baby. All right. I don't know. I think that those numbers, because I remember hearing before the election that it was really almost like 30% of Italians were willing to leave the euro or have a referendum. It's now above 50%. That means that number is going to continue to grow, because now that it's out there, now that they've actually gone through the election, they're on the other side of the psychological hump of saying, okay, the new guys can lead. Okay, yep, we're in this for the revolution. Okay, we can do this, because that's what has to happen. And these shifts, these political shifts, are psychological shifts, and these psychological shifts are very difficult to really get people to move, and it's a lot of inertia to overcome, or what we physicists would call the static coefficient of friction. That the impulse that you need to get started. It's like cranking amps off of your battery versus the steady state amperage that the battery puts out. Right, your car battery puts out 560 amps to get the alternator to turn and generate the spark necessary to ignite to get the spark to create the ignition to start the engine. But then it puts out a nice solid 12 volts after that, and a couple of amps. But it needs 600 amps and needs the ability to deliver that over a very short period of time. And that's the same thing that happens in political movement. That you have this impulse, this massive buildup of energy, and then once you release onto the other side, then you realize that, oh yeah, everybody was actually in favor of this, but they wouldn't admit it either to themselves or to a pollster or to their wives or their family or anybody else. And that's why Trump's approval numbers amongst black people have risen steadily. Not amongst black women, but certainly amongst black men, because he's doing good things for black men and therefore for black families. So, like it or not, that's what's happening. All right, that's mostly what I have for this afternoon. So let's watch what's happening in Italy very carefully. Let's watch what's happening at State Department. You'll know that Pompeo is serious about, I think, one of the things that we can look for. I'll know that Pompeo is serious about not just being on Trump's bandwagon, but on actually cleaning things up and finishing the work that Tillerson was supposed to have started. Because look, the legacy media in this country hates Tillerson. Go do a search on Tillerson worst Secretary of State, and you'll see it. There's so many articles from Salon, The Atlantic, this one, that one. It's all the same shit over and over and over again. It was a talking point put out by the DNC back in November, December, that Tillerson was the worst Secretary of State in the history of this country. Because why? Because he cleared out the 7th floor Foggy Bottom and fired all their access. That's why. He fired all their friends. And so they wrote hit pieces in return. It was easy. But we'll know that Pompeo is serious about the MAGA agenda if he starts going after, say, the Hungarian embassy. Let's watch for that. Or some other embassy where George Soros has a tremendous amount of influence. Hungary would be the big one. If Pompeo actually starts recalling diplomats from Hungary and starts firing people in the Hungarian embassy for being, agents of George Soros, or just firing them and, saying, oh, we're just cutting the money down, or revoking this, the funding that we put into to counteract Viktor Orban in the Hungarian elections, because we put like 700 grand into it. Then you'll know that you'll have your answer about Rex being a globalist first and a MAGA guy second. All right. You guys take care. You have a great afternoon. We'll talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.